I now recognize Mr. Timmons for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dadar, I want to begin by thanking you for your work with the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. We were able to get signed into law just in December the Improving Government for American Taxpayers Act. We hope that we can get the executive branch to act on your recommendations and probably save taxpayers billions and billions of dollars. So I just want to begin by thanking you for that. Mr. Horowitz, it seems that there's likely tens of billions of dollars in PPP loan fraud that has yet to be uncovered. Is that fair?
There is likely tens of billions.
Some estimates are as high as 100 billion, but we can just agree on tens of billions. That's fine. It seems to me that you have all of the information necessary at your disposal to identify this fairly rapidly. You look at the Q4, you get the business tax ID number, and you compare the Q4 withholdings for W-2 employees versus the amount of the PPP loan, and then the Q2 and Q3 of 2020 withholdings. And there should be an algorithm or some sort of a proportionality between those different numbers. So that should be some sort of a report that you can run, and then you can just start arresting people. Is that not how this should happen?
There might be a little more sophistication to it, perhaps, but let me just say, we don't have access to that data.
What do you need from Congress to, because it's literally a report. You should be able to run a report on those 4 data points, and then you're going to get tens of thousands of businesses that got PPP loans fraudulently, because if the metrics don't match up, then they lied and they stole and they need to go to jail. So what do you need?
A clear congressional action in legislation that says that. It took us, the fraud alert we issued this week, matching our information, and all we did was send name, date of birth, and social to the Social Security Administration and said, don't send us back your data, just give us yes, no answers. Are these the real names? It took us 10 months to do that.
Again, we agree that the Q4 withholdings of 2019 and the Q2 and the Q3 withholdings of 2020, plus the amount of the PPP loan, those numbers should have a proportional correlation that we can all agree is fairly straightforward. It's going to be up and down a little bit depending on how much your rent is, what your utilities are, but those numbers should all match up. And if there's a huge discrepancy in whatever that correlation is, then they probably stole and it was fraudulent. So do you just need us to force everybody to create that report?
What we need is access to data. It's what the controller said about just the death master file index.
I don't even think you need access to data. You need that report run, and you need to have all the list and the discrepancy and the correlation of those 4 metrics, and then you need to go and start putting people in jail.
We need the data analytics platform to continue, and we need access to all of this data, and Congress has to legislate that.
Do you need access to the data, or do you just need Treasury to run a report?
They won't run the report unless it's clear
We can make them run the report.
That's what we would need as well then. That's
I'm
correct.
sure that this is not a partisan issue. If people stole tens of billions of dollars in COVID relief, possibly denying benefits to people that actually needed it, those people need to be held accountable.
Agreed.
And the fact that here we are years later and we still have not done something that should literally be as simple as running a report in a computer at the Treasury Department. I mean, you just need us to pass a law making them do that.
We need a law. We would love to get employer identification number information.
Why would Treasury
to see if
not do
somebody
this?
actually exists.
Why would Treasury not do this?
Because there's federal laws like Section 6103 of the tax code that restricts sharing of tax information. We're now not talking just for the public's benefit, not individual income tax returns, what we're talking about, but 6103 is written broadly for a variety of very good reasons to limit where that information and tax information.
All right, well, look, there's 4 pieces of data that are attached to every business tax ID number, and this should be easy. I will work on legislation with everyone that is willing, and we will try to get you that information as quickly as possible. Okay. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Kassar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. I am so glad that we are having this hearing. After years in local government, working 24/7 during the pandemic to save lives and jobs in Texas, I have this opportunity to thank the Congress for their work, bipartisan work on the CARES Act, and thank you to congressional Democrats for the American Rescue Plan. Congress should be proud of the way that those bills helped save people's homes, kept people in their jobs, and kept people alive. I want to be clear, no one in the country is more strongly against fraud than my working class constituents who needed those COVID dollars to make sure their small businesses kept running, to make sure they got PPE at work, to make sure they got vaccines, to make sure their house wasn't foreclosed on. Any dollar taken from those programs by fraudsters is a dollar taken away from people who needed support. And similarly, we must be against fraudulent mischaracterizations of COVID relief programs that ultimately aim to reduce aid to people in need through these programs and other programs. We can talk all day in DC about COVID programs theoretically, but as a former city leader who put these programs in place, I can tell you that thanks to the work of the Congress and President Biden, local leaders in my community, 1, saved people's homes, 2, saved local economies, and 3, saved lives. So before I ask my question, I just want to share some facts that you may not have heard from Texas. 1, we kept people from losing their homes through protections against evictions and foreclosures, plus federal housing relief dollars. The city of Austin reduced evictions in 2021 by 75%, keeping thousands of people in their homes. Conservative estimates are that COVID housing programs kept over 1 million Americans from losing their homes. 2, we saved local economies. Because these programs and this kind of funding, the city of San Antonio in my district was able to support over 1,200 small family businesses, keeping them from closing, provided 160,000 meals to residents in need, trained over 5,000 struggling workers, putting thousands of people to work. The ARP kept 12 million people out of poverty, and pandemic relief programs, according to the CBO, kept GDP up 8 percentage points. And third, we saved lives. Thanks to the funding for vaccinations and public health programs, plus our COVID rules, the city of Austin had the lowest, along with Travis County, had the lowest COVID-19 death rate amongst our major Texas cities. Every death in our community was a tragedy, and if we had been able to achieve that same rate across Texas, we would have 45,000 more Texans who would have survived the pandemic. President Biden's vaccination strategy, along with local leaders' efforts, have kept nearly 500,000 people from being hospitalized. I just want to be clear, you cannot fraud your way to these lower COVID death numbers. You cannot cook the books and save this number of people from losing their homes or their jobs or their businesses. The hospital beds, the food lines, the morgues do not lie. These COVID relief programs did powerful work even while we continue to work to root out any instance of fraud. So what I want to ask our panel here today is that we, of course, need to focus on getting rid of fraud, but without telling these stories of success, we could weaponize accountability efforts to undermine these programs that you've said have helped struggling Americans. So in your time targeting fraud, can you give us examples of programs you've looked into that have functioned well, served the American people with urgency, and ensured that dollars actually got to the people that needed them the most?
I would say, Congressman, we haven't heard stories from people that said these programs are a complete waste. That is not what we've heard. We've heard success stories in many of the programs. We've talked about PPP and EIDL and the unemployment insurance. Restaurant revitalization program helped restaurants. The various state and local funding vehicles had a substantial impact. We actually have visited 6 communities as part of our oversight work and are working on a report on it to see how they used COVID-related funds, what impact it had on those communities. And so we've gone to communities around the country to get that information. The challenge has been making sure that large percentages of that money went to the people it was intended for and went to the communities it was intended to help. So I wouldn't come here and say, oh, we heard testimony these programs were bad. What we heard was these programs were helpful, and how do you fix the fraud to make sure the money goes to the right place?
Thank you for that. Yeah, of course, helping folks out in a mile-long food line, those folks aren't there committing fraud, but what we're trying to do here is make sure that we recover dollars that weren't getting to those folks.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Michael has said, but I'd also add, Operation Warp Speed, I thought was a very effective program. We were able, working with the private sector and government, to develop the vaccines in a record time. Normally it would take 10 to 15 years to develop a vaccine, but Operation Warp Speed worked, I think, extraordinarily well. The programs that provided funding to help support healthcare workers, providers was very effective as well. But all these programs had some level of effectiveness, but it could have been even more effective, is what we're saying. If all the money that was allocated was used properly, you could have maybe saved more people, helped more people out. And that's our goal.
Thank you. I think it's our goal as well. I yield back.
Gentlemen, time's expired. The chair recognizes Ms. McLean for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it. A little bit of background is I come from the financial services background. And I really want to focus on the waste, the fraud, and abuse, and really to represent the American people. In my background, if I were to defraud a client, probably two things would happen. One, I'd have to pay the money back. And two, I'd probably do a little time for that, and rightly so. So I want to really focus on what are the consequences and what are the penalties, and then what is the relationship, because if I understand it correctly, it's your job, Mr. Smith, to kind of make a preliminary case and then hand it over to the DOJ. Am I directionally correct on my understanding?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So in your testimony, you mentioned that the department has recovered over $1 billion, which I think is a good start. However, we still have $500 billion in potential fraud out there that we've just identified, and who knows, there might be more. So I'm curious as how many pandemic fraud cases your office has actually referred to the DOJ. Do you know that?
So to give you some background, we've opened over 5,000 cases since March of 2020. We obviously follow the evidence, and once we feel like there's once we feel like there's investigative merit, we take those cases to the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's offices, and those U.S. Attorney's offices look at those cases and the prosecutorial merit of those, along with other federal law enforcement entities, because it's not just the Secret Service, but other federal law enforcement entities who are bringing pandemic-related cases as well. So they have to deconflict and prioritize.
So let's stick with that theme, because I'm trying to get some answers. So you have over 5,000 cases. How many of those have you referred to the DOJ?
When we
Give or
open
take.
When we open a case, once we feel like there's enough evidence to move forward from a prosecutorial judicial standpoint, we present that case to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I don't have the breakdown of how many were presented yet. I can get that number back to you, though.
If you could, directionally, do you have an idea?
When we open a case,
Is it a 90% accept rate? Is it a 20%?
Well, accept rate is actually different than presentation rate, because when we open a case, the intent is to eventually present it to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Right. So I'm trying to make the correlation to you commit a crime, there is a consequence. And what I'm trying to do for the American people to help justify for them their tax dollars being misused on fraudulent basis, and I appreciate and applaud your efforts. I'm trying to connect the dots on what is the number. Directionally, you have no idea. Does the DOJ accept most of the cases? Are most of the cases that you find accepted?
I mentioned in a previous response, so as a federal law enforcement entity, we are, by nature, trying to go after the most egregious acts.
Sure.
That's why we train state and locals at our Computer Forensics Institute down in Alabama to focus on a local level. But we're confident our colleagues at the DOJ, they take as many cases as they can.
So with all due respect, you may be confident, but I don't know if the American people are confident with their tax dollars. And I don't mean any disrespect, but that's why I'm trying to ask these numbers, is to get some answers for the American people. Let me rephrase it. How many of these cases are currently being prosecuted by the DOJ? Do you know that?
I don't know that overall number for the Department of Justice. I do know that we've made over nearly 500 arrests since the beginning of the
Okay,
pandemic.
so you've made 500 arrests. What has the result of that been? So I know you've recovered over $1 billion, right? Any jail time?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk to that effect?
I haven't compiled the number of years or months total from the 500 arrests. I haven't done that, ma'am.
Okay, because I do think at the end of the day, just like we treat our children, if there's a consequence to your action, Mr. D'Addario, you talked earlier about deterrence. Well, part of the deterrence process may be actually if we publicly show the American people that we are going after these criminals, these people that are stealing Americans' hard-earned monies, and not only are we recovering the money, but they're doing time and hard time, that might help on the deterrence. So when can I expect some results or a report?
Matt, I'll give you a time frame on that when I get back to the team, but we've been pursuing results since the beginning of the pandemic.
But I'd like an accurate accounting of the results, if at all possible, and just to help on a positive note, saying, listen, we are good stewards of your money. We are trying to get your money back. So with that, I know I'm over time.
Right. The gentlelady's time's expired, but feel free to answer the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So far, according to the data that we've analyzed from the Department of Justice, there have been over 1,000 people who have pled guilty or have been convicted. There are over 600 charges pending against another 600 people. There have been at least 779 people who've been sentenced so far. This is on page 6 of my testimony, written testimony. Number of people have been, it's gone from 1 year of probation to 17 years in prison. So the sentences are significant. We have a number of individual examples sprinkled throughout our testimony. So that's a broad accounting at this point. Michael probably has even a more precise accounting.
Yeah, I was going to just build on that. There's the numbers, agree with Mr. D'Addario. Everything is on our public website. We post all of the cases that we're, as an Inspector General community, involved in. I couldn't agree with you more. The public needs to know there's consequences. Crime doesn't pay. And what we're going to do as Inspectors General, as long as that clock is running, and Congress last year extended it from 5 to 10 years in one group of cases, hopefully we'll do it in others, we're going to keep going. It's going to go for 7 more years or more. But we're going to hold everybody who we can hold accountable. And as Inspectors General, we don't care about dollar thresholds. We're going to go after the smallest dollar to the biggest. Obviously, you prioritize. We have multi-year sentences to date for some people. No one should think they got a get-out-of-jail-free card. But one of the things that can help, because we're not only talking about fraud, we're talking about improper payments, right, and recovering money. And so that's where one of the things I mentioned earlier, the Program Fraud Civil Remedies Act, it is an administrative way we can get money back. It's not criminal, but the taxpayers know we're getting the money back. Right now, the threshold to use it is $150,000. We want to raise it to $1 million so that we can go after that.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Crockett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've changed my question a little bit, so I'm going to go to my roots over here. As a criminal defense attorney, a lot of times I would voir dire a jury, and one of the questions that I would ask is it better to convict an innocent person or to let a guilty one go free? And oftentimes, the look that I'm seeing on Mr. Smith's face is the look that I would get from potential jurors, because for them it was an impossible question, because neither one of them sounded like a good resolution. And I bring this up because what we're talking about is government, which happens to be less than perfect. We are also talking about a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And so what I want to better understand is I want us to be real. I feel like in this hearing, we've talked a lot as if we can erode all bad guys, make criminals disappear. I believe in the opening remarks from Mr. Dodaro, he talked about the fact that basically there are those that were sitting and ready to pounce, not necessarily that the pandemic was producing some super criminal all of a sudden, but these are fraudsters. Many of them who had a record. When you talk about these sentences, one can presume that the higher sentences went with people that most likely had been in trouble at some point in time before in their lives. And so I want to talk about realistically, and I do want to, let me first begin by saying I applaud the efforts that all of you have made in your respective areas to make sure that we are doing our part. But I think that what we're losing sight of is we're losing sight of the fact that we save lives. And there were people that were in desperate need. And when we talk about our economy and the fact that we're still struggling to recover from the pandemic, we minimized some of that. This was a mitigation exercise that Congress had. And so while it may not have been perfect because there wasn't a playbook for the previous pandemic, because I'm guessing most of y'all weren't here 100 years ago, I'm trying to find out, when you look at it overall, if we wanted to be realistic about this imperfect system, what could we realistic, if we were to throw out percentages of fraud, or because I know that right now you don't have a crystal ball to know exactly how much fraud has occurred, but when we look at, say, other programs that have been rolled out, what is a good threshold for what we should anticipate as kind of part of the business that we unfortunately may endure when we're talking about such a large, government is big. And so it's definitely not perfect. There's a lot of people in it. What are we talking about realistically, and how far off of that mark were we when we look at these types of circumstances? And it doesn't matter who answers.
Yeah, Congressman, it's an excellent question, and I don't have any precise number I can tell you. I think for all of us who've done this for a while, the lack of preparedness and the management of the programs at the outset created a much larger opportunity for fraud than should have happened. Whether that should have been, as you noted, there's always going to be fraud in programs where there are some bad people out there who will, no matter how much you try, find their way to get the money illegally. But I think most of us think that number that percentage of fraud could have been much smaller than wherever we're going to end up here, had there been preparedness and action taken in advance.
Okay.
Part of the framework that we work with Congress to put in law back in 2016 requires a fraud risk assessment, a profile, but also a tolerance level for risk that would be set for every individual program. So you would make a conscious decision up front of what you're willing to tolerate in order to have that trade-off for speed and getting delivery of services out there as fast as possible to save lives, to help deal with economic consequences. Right now, it's just whatever happens to us as a government happens to us, and we deal with the consequences. And I've been involved, I've been a GA over 49 years, so we've been in a lot of disasters during that period of time. Katrina and the American Rescue Act during the Great Recession, the $700 billion to unfreeze the credit markets during the global financial crisis. In this situation, there's more fraud than we've seen in equivalent type of things over the years, recognizing that this was the biggest American rescue in history, in our history. But had it been, we've been better prepared and actually implemented the requirements for managing fraud consciously up front, we would have reduced the amount of fraud and made better use of that money to help really achieve the objectives of the legislation.
Thank you.
As I said in my opening remarks, I always think that collaborating, sharing information on the front end will lead to some mitigation of criminal behavior. But obviously, my experience as a law enforcement professional says, you know, that there's always going to be some element of criminal activity afoot.
Thank you so much.
Chair now recognizes